In the blistered heart of the desert, a weary art restorer named Elias Crane was about to uncover what should have stayed buried beneath paint and prayer. What started as a quiet restoration of an abandoned chapel bought for just $100 took a shocking turn when he came face to face with the impossible. The walls themselves were alive. Elias Crane wasn't your typical craftsman. For over 20 years, he had spent his life resurrecting beauty from decay, churches, cathedrals, frescoes forgotten by time, known for his meticulous hands and the calm patience of a man who trusted pigment more than people. When he encountered the chapel's choir of painted monks, their eyes shifting each dawn, their lips whispering his name through stone, he had no idea he was walking into a covenant older than the church itself. Elias responded the only way a restorer could, with reverence and denial, actions that would awaken a presence bound in color and sacrifice. What began as a simple act of preservation would become a haunting transformation. As Elias found himself painting souls that refused to die and confronting the masterpiece that wanted to finish him, the desert town of Voss Hollow would never be the same after the day. Elias Crane bought faith for $100 and learned that salvation sometimes demands a body, not a believer. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches, you make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The receipt looked like a joke someone had folded along the spine of the world and slipped into Elias Crane's pocket. $100. That was the price of the chapel, and whatever it still contained of heaven or hell. The paper was thin enough to see the ink bleed. The signature an unfamiliar flourish. Father Abram Voss. The loop on the V trailed off as if the hand had been tugged mid-stroke. Voss stood across from him beneath the shade of the post office awning, eyes glancing past Elias rather than at him, as though the horizon were answering questions Elias could not hear. "You'll want to get to it before the heat sets its teeth," the priest said. Dust filmed his boots the color of bone. "Keys are already in the lock. No bill of sale?" Elias asked, thumb on the receipt's crease. "You have my word." Voss's voice was smooth, a stone rolled by years of confession. "And the deed, consider it an act of stewardship for 100. Elias let the number hang. "You could buy a used ladder for more than that. You could buy Gilt's favorite chains, supplies, rags, solvent, all the ordinary tools he used to coax old paint back into breath." Voss's smile was narrow and incurious. "We undervalue what we don't understand. The town, if the scattered trailers and heat-warped storefronts could claim the title, kept its distance in the shimmering light, as if the day were an animal that might bolt. Elias had driven all night, the desert unspooling like an old film, light scratches becoming ribs of distant mesas, sky so open it made thought echo. He was tired and hungry, and the kind of careful you become after you've seen a boy fall through your hands like a dropped brush. Jonas. The name was a pill under his tongue, bitter whenever he thought too long. Why sell it at all? Elias asked. "Because questions were safer than memories." "Because I cannot keep it," Voss said, and for a heartbeat his tone fractured. "And because it wishes to be kept." Before Elias could press, the priest turned, not with the stiffness of age, but with the stillness of something that remembered movement and no longer needed it. He moved along the awning's edge, unhurried, the way a shadow moves when the sun decides. He did not look back. The chapel sat a mile out, where the desert gathered itself into a low rise of rock and creosote. From a distance it seemed intact, a pale wedge of stone, shouldering into the sky, the bell tower split like a cracked molar. Closer, the peculiarities announced themselves. The door, thick with a hand-forged ring, had fresh oil slicking the metal. The windows, dusty from the outside, held no dust on their inner sills when he peered through. And beneath the lizard track and windscript on the steps, chopped marks, as if someone had scraped away footprints he had expected ruin. He found instead a space that felt paused. Elias slid the key home. The lock turned as if pleased to be used. The door breathed open on a hinge that sighed. Cold air spilled around his legs, the chill of cellars and long-kept jars. He hesitated at the threshold, a reflex learned from churches and studios. Honor the space you're about to enter. The ravens that had been riding the thermals pivoted above him and gathered in a slow ring, black commas against the noon. Inside, silence collected the way dust does in abandoned places, thick in corners. He stood in the nave and let his eyes adjust. The stone was the pale of old teeth, the roof timbers arched with a carpenter's forgotten pride. And the walls, God, the walls. At first he read them as decay, flaked pigment, salt bloom, the familiar scab of time. Then he saw the order in the ruin. Strata of painting lay like geological layers, one image under another, palimpsests pressed down by centuries of revised prayers. He took a step forward. A faint arrangement of silhouettes rose from the plaster, figures without faces, bodies in the suggestions of robes, arranged in tiers like a choir at rest. The light through the clerestory windows broke across them, and in that bright interruption he thought he saw movement. No, not movement, but a change of emphasis, as if lines were reassigning themselves between one blink and the next. Because it wishes to be kept, Elias murmured, and the air chilled along his teeth. He walked the perimeter, sketchbook in hand, cataloguing damage by instinct. Here a flensed saint's palm. There the curve of what might have been a monstrance, discontinued and buried by later hands. He traced the profile of a hood with a gloved finger and felt the grit lift easily, as if the dust had only just settled. He crouched by a section where plaster had been patched, not with the coarse grit of the original, but a modern gypsum, the kind stocked at the hardware store on the edge of town. Near the baseboard, a fleck of blue rested like a feather. He rolled it between finger and thumb. Fresh. Someone had been painting here recently. He set his kit down, solvent, soft brushes, the delicate knives he used to tease back time without tearing it. Beneath his touch, color breathed through grime. Reds he recognized as hematite, yellows heavy with ochre, a white that held the faintest sheen of shell. The palette was archaic and intimate, the kind of pigments you bind with egg and prayer. By dusk, he had cleaned 2 square feet. It revealed nothing definitive, more robe, more suggestion, a shoulder that curved toward an absent face. He stood to stretch and felt the weight of the desert press against the walls. Outside, the ravens settled into the slope with the satisfaction of creatures returning to an old story. Elias locked the door. The metal was cold. He slipped the key into his pocket and tried not to hear the echo it made against the receipt. On the way to his rented room, he told himself what he always told himself when a project turned from possibility to gravity. You will save this. You will save what can be saved. He did not look back at the bell tower. He did not see Father Abram Voss standing where the road met the dust, hands hidden in his sleeves like a monk posed for a painting, head tilted at the chapel as if listening for a response. He was at the chapel before sunrise. The sky, the color of raw cotton, pulled thin. The lock turned again with that. At noon, a truck rattled up and idled. The door swung open, and a man climbed down with the stoop of somebody who learned to duck around rafters before he learned to drive. He wore a hat bleached by years and hands as competent as pliers. "You Elias?" The man called, stopping just inside the threshold as if a dog might be sleeping there. He glanced around without crossing himself, but with the same caution a cross might provide. "I am. Can I help you?" "Name's Caleb Wren. Folks said you needed a pair of hands that know when to stop." He wiped his palm on his jeans and offered it. His shake was neat and weirdly light. "Also said you paid fair." "Fair's all I know." Elias found himself relieved at the interruption. Work could tip easily into reverie in places like this. "You have experience with old buildings?" "Some." Caleb's eyes slid to the painted walls. "My granddad poured footing out here when I was a kid. He told me the foundation never dried right. Said it always felt damp. In the desert." He let the words sit like a coin. "He didn't come back after that summer. Folks say he left for work in Nevada. Mama said not to ask more." Elias nodded toward a stack of drop cloths. "Help me lay those. Try not to touch the plinths. The stucco flakes if you breathe on it wrong. Caleb moved with an instinctive respect for fragile things. He whistled once under his breath, then stopped as if the sound made him self-conscious, and the building had scolded him. "People talk about this place," he said after a while. "About the painted choir." Elias kept his eyes on the work. "A local legend." "Maybe not all that local." Caleb's fingertips hovered an inch above a section where the plaster had taken a new color after cleaning, a muted green that felt like shade in the corner of a mouth. "They say the monks put voices in paint, trap them like flies in amber. You look long enough, you can hear 'em sing. That's apocrypha," Elias said, almost kindly. But as he said it, he realized he'd been holding his breath. "We all got something we can't explain." Caleb gave a small shrug. "I figure superstition's just pattern seeing we ain't earned the math for yet." They worked until the shadows lengthened, until the chalk grid looked like the ghost of a map. Elias lost the easy rhythm he usually found in restoration. Here, the more he revealed, the less he understood. Under a swath of grime, he found brushstrokes that refused to belong to their century. Short, crisp, the kind of articulate edge you get with sable and a steady hand trained on anatomy. Yet the underdrawing beneath it, faint scorings and pricked outlines, dated to a much older method. It was as if one hand had been working through another across time. When they broke for water, Caleb stood in the aisle and tilted his face up as if listening to something beyond the roof.
"Hear that?"
Elias set down his cup. The desert hum, the insects, the distant highway, the small private scrape of wind along stone, remained. Under it, a thread of something else. Not quite music, not quite language. The sensation was less of sound than of being near sound's memory, like standing in a theater after the audience has gone, air holding the last chord. He swallowed. "Probably the tower," he said. "Wind in the bell." The bells cracked. Caleb said it matter of fact, and Elias felt foolish for not noticing. By late afternoon, Elias's certainty, his practiced stance against fanciful thinking, had shifted. He marked each section he'd cleaned, then chose a lower panel whose paint had blistered in uneven scales. He lifted one scale with the scalpel. The edge came free with a soft sigh. Beneath was a smear of ultramarine, vivid as if woken. And there, in that blue, the thinnest thread of a line, fresh enough to shine, a recent brushstroke traveling across centuries of pigment. He stared at it until his eyes burned. "Someone's painted here," he said. Not to Caleb, not to anyone, but to the room itself. Caleb made a small sign in the air that might have been for luck. "He told you the stories weren't just for campfires." Evening gathered at the windows. The inside of the chapel dimmed to a kind of underwater light, green and blue and bruise. Elias packed slowly, reluctant as if leaving would let the walls rearrange while his back was turned. Caleb lingered at the door. "You sure you want to be out here at night?" he asked. "Some places keep late hours you don't want to keep with them." "I'll be back at dawn," Elias said. "I need to catalog the nave properly." Caleb hesitated. "You see anything that looks like you start running?" Elias almost laughed. He did not. "I'll see you in the morning." The lock slid home. The ravens, restless on the ridge, rose an inch and settled, the way sleepers adjust in their dreams. He took his notes back to the rented room and spread them across the small table. He traced his chalk grid in pencil, cross-referencing with photographs on his phone. Nothing should have moved. Everything felt slightly different. A chair in a familiar room nudged only enough to stub a toe. He lay down without meaning to and woke hard from a dream he could not keep. Something about choir stalls and a mouth opening where a mouth was not, and fumbled for the receipt to prove to himself that he had chosen this. The paper rasped under his fingers, real and absurd. Before the sun cleared the hills, he was back at the chapel. He set the key, turned the lock, stepped into the cold. At first he thought the light was different, and that was all. Morning fogged through the clear story, laying pale bands across the nave. Then his body recognized what his mind refused, a displacement so slight it felt like vertigo. He moved to the section he had cleaned. The silhouettes stood where he had left them, shoulders, hoods, the gentle slope of empty faces. One of those faces had eyes now, not painted as decoration, not the flat, symbolic gaze he'd restored 100 times in older churches, but eyes with depth, with a point of light specular enough to catch. They were turned a fraction off-center, looking not at the altar or the aisle or heaven, but directly at him. Elias did not drop the kit in his hand. He did not speak. He set the kit down with careful fingers and, without meaning to, took one step closer. The air grew colder. The receipt rustled in his pocket, a small animal shifting in sleep. Somewhere overhead a raven called, a grating syllable like scraped stone. "I see you," Elias said softly to keep from saying anything else. The eyes did not blink. They did not need to. Elias slept little and poorly, his dreams full of scaffolding that leaned like tired bones and blue paint that ran uphill. By the third dawn, the chapel had become a second ribcage. He breathed easier inside it than out. The eyes on the wall watched him with a patient indifference he might have mistaken for kindness if he were someone else. He worked beneath that gaze, as if under a foreman. A square of soot gave way to a passage painted in miniature, a town street with hard noon shadows knifing the dust. The perspective was wrong in a way that made the scene feel truer. The road narrowing faster than geometry allowed, the buildings leaning together as if conspiring. He leaned close, brush in one hand, cotton swab in the other, and felt the hair along his arms rise despite the heat. Smoke bled from a tiny door where, yesterday, there had been none. He cleaned further. A man appeared in the doorway, head thrown back, hammer raised. In the hammerhead's flat glint, he recognized the blacksmith's tool he'd seen at the edge of town, an anvil squatting under a sun-torn awning, a boy pumping the bellows, while his father, a broad-shouldered man with an easy nod, mended a horseshoe. "Caleb," Elias said tightly. "Come look." Caleb clomped over, wary of the drop-cloths like they were ponds. He squinted. "That's Harlan, and that's his shop. Did it look like this yesterday?" "No." Caleb's voice softened, as if the wall might be listening. "No, sir?" Elias swallowed the tin taste that rose in his mouth. "It's more likely that the image was simply obscured." He spoke the sentence like a line from a manual, as if words could become bracing. Caleb was not disrespectful, only unconvinced. He tapped the brim of his hat, a reflexive prayer. "Obscured is a word folks use when they don't want to say hiding." They went back to work. Elias cleaned until his fingers cramped, then flexed them, then cleaned some more. By afternoon, the miniature had sharpened into narrative, flame ribboning out of the forge, the blacksmith's beard catching an ember, a shape hard to resolve, at the window, as though the glass held someone watching. "Coincidence," Elias said, "because the alternative was too large to hold at once, as if the desert had been waiting for its cue." A column of smoke pushed up beyond the ridge. Caleb turned first. "Christ," he said, "not as a curse, but as a map." "That's Harlan's!" They ran. The chapel door slammed itself with a cough that felt impatient. Heat met them halfway, the forge gulping at the air, flame leaping like a thing that loved its work. The blacksmith's boy, face ash-streaked, shouted words that had lost their order. Volunteers formed a line with buckets that looked bare-handed against the blaze. The corrugated roof pranged like a broken bell. Elias stood in the street, heart stuttering, as if he were coming awake into an old nightmare. He saw the sagging flank of a scaffold, Jonas looking up the way fear rippled his skin. The present washed over him like solvent, thinning, then clarifying. He grabbed a tarp, beat at falling ember, dragged water, slipped, cursed, tried to be no one and be useful. When it ended in that terrible way fires do, as if a decision had been reached. The forge's roof caved with a soft submission. The line slowed, then stopped, then became a ring around a heat that now had no more appetite. In the ruin, they found what they always find. Harlan's body lay where the joist had surrendered, eyes soot-filmed, his hammer still in hand. The boy made a sound Elias would carry in the marrow, a child's voice cracking around a man's grief. Elias stepped forward, then back. His throat had shrunk to a straw. Caleb's hand on his shoulder guided him out of the circle, back toward air that could be breathed. "That's not your fault," Caleb said low. "Don't you dare let it be." Elias stared at his blackened palms. The miniature inside the chapel had been accurate to the angle of a roof beam. He tasted iron. "Caleb," he said, "I think the walls are—" "Don't say it," Caleb answered quickly, as if naming invited it closer. "Just don't be here alone." They returned at dusk. The chapel accepted them with a cooler silence than before, like a room after a fight. Elias knew where to look. The miniature had completed itself without his hand. The painted Harlan lay in glory he hadn't earned, a sainting that felt like mockery. Above him, in the window's gloss, a pale oval suggested a face not yet resolved. Caleb stood a step back, hat in hand, reluctance honest as prayer. "If that wall paints me, I ain't coming back through that door." Elias wanted to say that walls do not paint, that pigment is dead rock that only remembers river. Instead, he said, "We'll document everything. We'll make a record." "That what you tell yourself?" Caleb asked softly, "when the river starts talking back." They slept badly, if at all. The next morning, a woman waited on the stone stoop when Elias arrived. She wore a sun-bleached skirt and a clean white blouse buttoned to the throat, a practical hat, and dark, sensible shoes. Her hands were folded, but not like she was praying. Like she was keeping still two animals that wished to run. "I'm looking for Elias Crane," she said the moment he neared. "I'm Elias." "Sister Maeve Delaney," she said, then smiled in apology and shook her head. "Maeve now. I left the sister behind with the rest of the habit." "You're welcome," Elias said, and meant it, though he didn't know why his chest loosened an inch. "Did Father Voss send you?" The smile thinned. "Father Voss sends no one. He suggests trails." She looked past him into the cool. "May we?" They stepped inside. Maeve stopped just over the threshold. The temperature seemed to surprise her, and not surprise her in equal measure. "You know this place," Elias said. "I used to keep its keys." She unclasped her hands, took off her hat, and looked at the nave with a surveyor's stillness. "We called it a chapel. It is more precisely a reliquary. For what?" Caleb asked, appearing from the shadows with the light tread of someone who had been listening. Maeve considered him, then the walls. For voices. She walked the nave slow. When she reached the place where the painted eyes regarded the aisle, she drew a breath and let it out, as if releasing a secret. "Some walls keep weather out," she said. "Some things in. You've opened both." Elias showed her the miniature of the forge. She did not flinch. He showed her the fresh, bright stroke of ultramarine, where there should have been only damp old blue. She did not gasp. He expected the posture of the devout, the shrug of superstition. Instead, she gave him the quiet of a scientist delivered an equation she had long suspected. "It isn't that the paintings change," she said, almost gently. "It's that they are being completed. This is a choir. Choirs sing what is written, but they require a conductor to start. And who is conducting?" Elias asked, though the answer swelled between them. "You are," Maeve said. "Unless you refuse it." Elias tried on a laugh. It didn't fit his mouth. "Refusal seems difficult." "It is," she agreed, "but not impossible. There is a crypt." The word buckled something inside him. "A crypt?" Maeve nodded toward the altar. "Below. The bishop sealed it before my time. I saw it once." Her jaw tightened, a small shudder at the hinge. "And a mural that bled." "Bled," Caleb repeated, not derisively. "We painted with egg and oil," Maeve said. "What we sealed with was not paint." They moved the altar's runner and the iron candle holders aside. Maeve knelt and found, by memory more than sight, a seam disguised as a hairline crack. Her fingers traced an invisible sigil. She pressed where a carpenter would never press. Stone shifted with a groan older than the town. The panels slid back to reveal a staircase narrow enough to bruise shoulders. Cold gathered at the opening like fog. The smell was sudden and old, beeswax, lime, a faint sweetness that might have been incense or rot. Maeve lit a taper with the flint she'd brought in her pocket, as if she'd known the dark would ask for fire. "Careful," she said. "The steps sometimes forget their steps." They descended. The light wavered against plaster that had not seen sun for decades. Along the walls, sarcophagi shouldered one another. stone boxes with lids engraved in relief, robed figures lying as if the sea had rocked them to stillness. Latin threaded in bands beneath their hands. Elias bent and brushed away a film of mineral bloom. Letters rose from the powder like bones after rain. Vox Dei in pigmento, the voice of God in pigment. Caleb, hat against his chest, read it twice and shook his head. God's got better places to talk. The monks hungered, Maeve said simply. They wanted to keep revelation from slipping through mortal fingers. So they learned a way to fix vision to matter. They called it preservation. They refused to call it what it was. And what was it? Elias asked, though the answer had already formed like a taste. Iron, salt, ash. Binding, she said. A pact. Elias felt the chapel breathing around them. Slow, tidal. He reached for the nearest wall with his gloved hand and felt a hum, not of machinery, but of hive. Listen, Maeve whispered. He did. From above, maybe from within. Threads of sound braided, vowelless, wordless, voices like air through reeds. His scalp prickled. If he had been the man he was 10 years ago, he might have called it pareidolia. He had been other men since. They followed the corridor to a small apse where frescoes crowded one another, colors richer for being denied light. The monks were painted at work, grinding pigment with torsion in their shoulders, kneeling with bowls, faces turned not upward to heaven, but inward toward their own hands. In the last panel, one monk faced the viewer, lips parted, tongue dark as if dipped. Maeve's candle shivered. I was here, she said softly. I was young. The abbot, Father Voss then, taught us to tend the silence. One night the mural at the apse began to weep. Not water, something thicker. And the singing. She closed her eyes. Have you ever heard your own name sung by a room, Elias Crane? It makes obedience feel like love. Elias drew closer to the painted monk's mouth. In the trick light, the tongue's darkness was not pigment, but a stain that had seeped. He smelled iron again, fresh, impossible. Why did you leave? Caleb asked. He was not prying. He was reading the air, because I watched a man vanish. Maeve's eyes were open again, steady on Elias's. He stood in prayer. The fresco took his likeness by degrees, the cheeks, the brow, and then it took him. Not his body. His body stayed and named that miracle, but the light that was him went into the wall like breath. They climbed back to the nave half-blind, the sudden daylight unkind to pupils grown wide. Elias needed to see something living. He set his tools at the southern panel and began to clean, as if cleaning could make time visible and manageable again. It happened first as a pressure under his fingernails, then a wetness that was not solvent. He lowered the scalpel and saw, along the hairline crack of old plaster, a red seep. It welled slowly, then tracked downward in a thin, obedient line. Caleb swore softly. Maeve did not move. It's a seep from the roof, Elias said, a child arguing with weather. Then the smell struck him, copper and clove. The line found the crook of a painted elbow and pooled there, bright as a jewel. In the choir above, the faceless figures seemed to incline infinitesimally, as if listening for a cue. He pressed a clean rag to the crack. The cloth drank and stained. He felt dizzy, as if some other pair of hands were wrapped around his, coaxing rather than forcing. A brush he hadn't lifted slid an inch in its tray. He could swear the bristles had been dampened. Don't, Maeve said quietly. The word arrived late. Elias had already set the brush to the wall. It was like picking up a melody mid-chorus. The line he drew belonged to a song he had not learned and could not stop singing. The sable's tip moved with a certainty that felt merciful. He laid shadow into a hood, cast light on a cheek that had not existed a moment ago, lifted a glint to an eye. Elias, Caleb said. His voice small. He stepped back. In the lower register, third row, second from the aisle, a monk looked out from the wall with the calm of someone who had expected to be found. The paint was still wet. The mouth was small and almost amused. The eyes were open. The eyes were open. Caleb lingered near the doorway the way a man will hover at the edge of a photograph he doesn't wish to be in. Elias worked under the wet-eyed monk, hands moving like someone smoothing a fever dream back into a bed. He could not reconcile the comfort of the brush in his fingers with the dread that tightened his ribs. "Stop," Caleb said. "Not loud, the way you say it when a friend is sleepwalking toward a roof's edge." "Please," Elias set the brush down. The sable's tip quivered once in the tray, as if reluctant to leave the line it had been taught. He wiped his palms and turned to Caleb, willing a normal voice. "You don't have to stay." Caleb gave a humorless huff. "That's true in more ways than I like." He stepped forward, squinting, and his face drained in one motion, the way shade runs across a field when a cloud decides. "No," he whispered. "No, no." Elias felt the chill before he saw it, a drop in temperature that made the chapel's silence brittle. In the choir's lower register, in a niche half hidden by a column of grime, a new figure had begun to lift itself out of stain. The shoulders first, broad, familiar. The hands, square-palmed, the left with a small scar at the base of the thumb where a saw had once slipped. Caleb's likeness, still soft as breath on glass, was emerging in the paint. He reached for it without meaning to, fingers hovering an inch from the wall. "That ain't me," Caleb said, almost pleading with the word itself. "It's a trick of light." "It's not yet finished," Elias said. "It can be undone. Fresco secco gives you a window. Don't give me windows when I need a door." Caleb's face hardened into the shape fear takes when it decides to fight. He grabbed a tarpole, reversed it, and drove the wooden tip toward the damp paint. The chapel answered. It was not wind, though windows shattered as if a gale had lifted out of the apse. It was not thunder, though the roof timbers thumped like a struck drum. Dust blew from the walls in a breath so unified it felt like a single word spoken by many throats at once. The pole leapt out of Caleb's hands as if tugged, clattered across the nave, and ribs of shadow ran like water along the ceiling. "Don't!" Maeve cried, stepping between Caleb and the painting. The candle she held guttered, then flared with a blue tongue, as if tasting something alive. "It will take faster if you struggle. You want me to just stand here and let it hang me?" Caleb's voice cracked. "Like a portrait over a mantle?" "We can seal it," Maeve said. "There is still a way." "Seal me?" He laughed, one note bright as broken glass. "I ain't a hole, sister." Elias reached for him. Caleb jerked away, then caught himself and took Elias's wrist in both hands, grip hard enough to bruise. "I got a mother who counts my Sundays," he said, eyes fixed on Elias's with startling steadiness. "If I'm a picture tomorrow, you will go tell her with your mouth. You hear me? Not a letter, not a rumor. Your mouth. I won't let this happen," Elias said, and hated the shape of the lie. Caleb nodded once, like a man who has already decided to forgive something he knows is coming. He backed toward the door. "I'll see you in the morning," he said. "If God who doesn't live here is willing." The heat outside slammed him with the small mercy of air that was only air. Elias watched the empty doorframe afterward, feeling that he had just witnessed someone step onto a stage, built only to collapse. He worked through the afternoon like penance, each cotton swab a bead on a rosary. The painted Caleb continued to gather itself without him. The jawline clarified, the eye sockets deepened. A hint of a hat brim suggested the ghost of a shadow. Elias set his tools down and forced his hands still by clenching them against the pew back until the tendons hurt. He was not painting, he told himself. He was not painting. The wall was, twilight stretched the nave, made it longer than it had been at noon. Maeve said she would sit up in prayer. Elias did not ask whom she intended to address. He left with the sun like a red coin between two hills and walked the road back white-knuckled. The receipt a crumpled cool in his pocket, like a charm that had forgotten its spell. He woke to pounding, fists at the motel door, then boots in the hallway. Then his name called in a voice that had already practiced breaking bad news. The sheriff stood there with his hat off. The brim had a clean sweatband line, Caleb Wren, the sheriff said, not unkindly. Scaffold at the new feed store gave out about midnight. He was up there fixing a pulley that didn't need fixing. The man's eyes shifted, a flinch from what came next. We found him under it. Elias's body remembered how to fall before his knees did. He grabbed the doorframe instead and held on until wood pressed ridges into his palm. The sheriff kept speaking, formalities, arrangements, things a county says to a morning, but sound slid off the world. The motel hallway shortened into a throat. Jonas's name uncoiled from the place Elias kept it, reached up, looped around this fresh grief, and pulled tight. By the time he returned to the chapel, the sun had not yet climbed. The lock took the key like a priest receives a confession. The cold stepped outward to meet him. Elias walked down the aisle without looking left or right and stopped where he already knew he would. Caleb's portrait was finished. Not a saint, not beautified, not lifted into icon. Simply Caleb as he would pause at a threshold, one shoulder shy, mouth set like a man who makes and unmakes laughter every day. The paint at the corners of his eyes had been laid with a tenderness that made Elias's throat sting. He reached for the portrait and let his fingers fall. Maeve stood in the apse, arms folded across herself as if to keep from shaking apart. "I can't," Elias said. "I can't let it. It already has," Maeve answered, not unkind. "Grief is quicker than fire." He stepped back, and the choir seemed to incline again, and almost bow, as if acknowledging a new section's completion. The chapel smelled of extinguished candles, though no wick had burned. "You told me there was a way," he said, voice ragged. "A seal." "There is a way," Maeve said, "but not to change what's been sung, only to stop the song from choosing another conductor." Elias pressed both hands over his eyes until colors burst in the dark, bruised flowers. When he lowered them, the walls were the same and everything else was different. "Then we go to Voss," he said. "If he put me here, he can take me out." Maeve glanced toward the door, where light had begun to pencil a line. "He will not refuse an audience," she said, with the bleak certainty of someone describing weather. They walked to the rectory at the edge of town, a low house with a porch that watched the road with patient suspicion. Father Abram Voss stood on the step as they approached, as if he had been sketched there in anticipation, and only now filled in. The air around him felt unstirred, like a room with windows painted shut. "You came," Voss said. "As mild as tea. You sold me a tomb," Elias said, before the training that kept him polite could catch up. "I sold you a key," Voss replied. "Tombs and keys often look alike." They sat in the rectory parlor, where lace curtains yellowed the light and the milk on the tray never quite filmed. Voss poured. The tea steamed, scented with a sweetness Elias couldn't place. Anise or old pages breathed on. The priest's hands were pale and composed, the knuckles delicate as a scholar's. "You are not what you are," Elias said, staking the ground because fear, when named, sometimes steps back. "You are a remainder." Voss smiled with something almost like relief. "Few see it so quickly." Maeve's jaw tightened. "He knows because the choir sang through him. That is their design," Voss said. He rested his fingertips together. The gesture looked practiced over centuries. "You have my apology, Elias. It will not assist you." "What did your order do?" Elias asked. "Plainly." Voss's eyes went to the window, as if the desert were a book he was about to cite. "We were afraid," he said. "That was our first prayer and our last. Scripture erodes in men. Bells crack. Tongues die. So we asked God to let vision endure. We believed art could fix revelation, make it immune to the rot of time. A noble greed. And you bound souls," Elias said. "It proved necessary," Voss answered, and the soft syllables outraged more than a shout would have. "Pigment holds poorly without binder. We found a binder that did not fail." Maeve's voice was level and shaking both. "You harvested penitence. You baptized terror." "Hush, child," Voss said, and the old authority slid across the room like a shadow. "We offered immortality. We offered purpose. You offered prison," Elias said. Voss considered him, and the serenity in his face shivered, revealing the seam where it had been lacquered on. "Prisons keep worse things in," he said softly. "You must understand the arithmetic. The visions did not stop with glorious annunciations. They showed us endings, fires, murders, plagues, false prophets with crowds like tidal flats. We thought if we could pin those visions in paint, we could study them, forewarn." He splayed his hands. "The choir sings what must not be ignored." and kills to prove itself, Elias said. Foreknowledge alters the path, Voss said. We learned that too late. Once the choir had a mouth it wished to taste. The visions called for keepers. He offered Elias an apologetic tilt of the head. We are keepers. We are what the song consumes to sustain itself. Maeve took a breath, and it rattled. Tell him the last part. Voss's gaze did not flicker. When the final panel is finished, the current abbot's soul enters the wall, and the next is chosen by his hand. Each voice freed by a successor's arrival. A relay, a mercy, Elias laughed. It sounded like a plank breaking. You're trapped until I agree to be trapped, until you accept the brush, Voss said. You already have in your heart. It will only take your name at the end. Elias's stomach turned, and the tea in his cup went cold, as if it had been pretending its steam. Caleb is dead, Voss closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were dry. So was Jonas before you arrived at my door. Elias flinched as if struck. You don't get to say his name. Do you think I do not also carry them? Voss's voice thinned. The boys whose fingers crushed pigment for me. The men and women who stood too close to the song. It is not a list. It is a litany. One day it will be yours. I won't take it, Elias said. I'll burn it down. Maeve's hand touched his sleeve. We tried, she said, almost in apology. Fire makes shadow move. It does not make it leave, Voss rose. The light that fell through the lace slid along his sleeve and failed to dapple the floor. Elias saw it and felt his stomach fall. An echo that does not take light. Return to the chapel, Voss said. If you must refuse, do it there. But understand this. Refusal is a choice that costs other names. He looked almost tender. I would free you if I could. I would free myself. Outside, ravens stitched circles above the rectory, as if marking a center. Elias walked with Maeve back along the bleached fence line. The desert looked the way a canvas feels before the first stroke, too open, too hungry. By the time the chapel rose, small and stubborn on its knoll, Elias felt the decision inside him forming the way salt forms, slow, inevitable. Crystal by crystal around a seed, they entered to a draught that smelled faintly of slaked lime and something like clove again. The choir had grown fractionally fuller in the hours they'd been gone. A fourth row deepened, shadows snicked into sharper shapes. On a narrow pilaster behind the altar, a reflection had begun to appear. A figure turned, as if seen through a sheet of glass. Elias leaned. The figure leaned, not a mirror. His own features lagged by a heartbeat, eyes following a fraction late, like a puppet learning its strings. Don't look, Maeve warned. I looked the moment I signed, Elias said. He lit candles, not for prayer, but for light he could control. Flame threw small, livable suns against the frost of the room. He opened his kit, fingers moving with a ritual certainty, and set a clean brush across his palm, weighing its length, its willingness. The choir inhaled. He heard it, an intake soft as many pages turned at once. Show me the seal, he said to Maeve, not looking away from the wall. Her voice changed on that single word, took on the cadence of remembered instruction. Anoint the threshold and the font. 3 circles. Salt the lintel. Close the crypt with the sign the abbot taught us to open it. She hesitated. And a life. It asks a life. Elias did not respond. He dipped the brush and drew a line where the wall's crack had bled, this time not as a singer in a choir, but as a man trying, against music, to write a rest. The bristles glided obedient. Behind him, the air pressed down, as if an unseen congregation had risen to its feet. From the plaster, somewhere between pigment and stone, a whisper braided itself into a single word. Elias. The chapel pulsed with whispers. Faces within the fresco shifted, mouthing Elias's name. From the painted shadows, a boy's form emerged. Jonas, his lost apprentice, eyes pleading, lips moving without sound. Maeve stood trembling, murmuring prayers that twisted into apologies. The walls breathed, stretching like lungs. Every sigh echoed with memories not his own. It wants release, Maeve said. Or a replacement. Elias felt the brush lift in his hand, guided by unseen fingers. They lit the sacred oil. Flames crawled across the murals, and the painted choir screamed. Maeve vanished mid-prayer. her image blazing onto the wall beside his. He set the brush down carefully. "Then we finish it," he said, voice steady and exhausted. "Or we teach it how to stop, somewhere, either in the tower or nowhere at all." The bell gave a hairline sound, a cracked note that was not a strike so much as a shiver. Outside, the ravens pivoted together, like a black comma placed mid-sentence. Smoke still stitched the rafters like grey lace. Ash softened the edges of everything, the pews, the kneeler, the brass that would not tarnish no matter how long it endured sorrow. Elias coughed once and tasted old almond from the sacred oil, a sweetness that had nowhere to go. On the apse wall, Maeve knelt forever where she had vanished, her painted hands folded at the exact angle he remembered from the heartbeat before the fire seized her. The choir around her glowed as if backlit by embers that would never cool. "Forgive me," Elias said to the wall, to the room, to the name that lived behind his tongue. No sound returned, no hush of feathers, no mutter of spectral throats. Silence had entered like a bishop and taken the front pew. He realized with a shiver that was almost gratitude how much easier it was to breathe when the chapel did not breathe with him. He cleaned the brush he had dropped when Maeve disappeared, rinsing sable in a jar of turpentine he no longer needed. Habit, he thought. The motions that saved him once now simply delayed him. His hands steadied, as if the bench beneath him had grown roots. He set out the pigments one by one. Ochre, vermilion, bone-black, lead-white, the jar of ultramarine that looked, absurdly, exactly like sky. The layout resembled an altar more than a palette. "Every masterpiece needs a keeper," Father Voss had said, once on the rectory steps. And again, in Elias's dreams, his voice arriving from a distance that measured years rather than feet. It occurred to Elias that keepers do not only tend, they complete. They make the last mark others cannot bring themselves to make. He stood. The receiving hush of the room thickened, like cloth arranged for a ritual. He half expected Voss to step from a shadow, sleeves tucked in that monkish way that hid what hands are guilty of. But the priest was absent, or already watching through the paint. "Jonas," Elias whispered, "because the name must be spoken when the knife goes into the knot, when the cut is honest. I owe you the truth of my hand." He climbed the ladder. It did not wobble today. The legs, braced with the care of a man who had learned the cost of negligence, bit the flagstones with a satisfied little sound. At the upper register, the final blank sat like winter between two late roses. The plaster there was smooth, the skim coat pearl pale. In faint graphite, a grid waited for transfer lines, his own scaffolding of geometry. Across the span, suggestions had already risen. The soft oval of a cheek, the ghost cross of a brow and nose, the barest flare of a nostril. Someone had sketched him, or the wall had. "Let me do it," Elias said, and the simple permission calmed him. He dipped the brush in the thinnest wash of umber. The sable's hair whispered across plaster. A temple darkened. A jaw gained courage. The bridge of a nose became less hypothetical. He expected resistance, the drunk pull of possession, the guiding pressure he'd felt before. Instead, the hand that moved was his, obedient to the intent behind his ribs. And yet, the line wanted to sing. It wanted to be more than anatomy. He allowed it. He let the cadence of the choir's earlier work into his wrist, the short, decisive stroke, the small restraint at the corners of the mouth, the light that sits where joy might have sat if history permitted joy. He painted his own eyes last. When the moment arrived, he nearly balked. "Eyes and stories. They announce the painting has noticed you." He sharpened his brush, stippled a pinhead of white on each iris, set the pupils deep. A likeness looked back at him, Elias as he was today, wind-chapped, grief-bruised, with a privacy he had never managed to conceal from anyone who loved him. The chapel exhaled. A pressure uncoiled from the stones, like a rope cut. Somewhere behind the wall, not in the air but in the fact of the place, a chain rattled and fell. The sound did not echo. It absorbed. Elias felt the temperature rise by the width of a thought. On the floor below, a ripple crossed the nave, candle flames leaning toward the apse in a single delicate bow. The painted choir brightened, Not bleach, but bloom, as if someone had opened the shutters in a room no one knew had windows. Paint took life the way bread takes water. Abbot, a voice breathed. No one's and everyone's. Keeper, Elias descended. Each wrung a vow he would not let himself recant. His knees threatened to betray him. He made them honest by bending carefully. When he reached the flagstones, he turned. Father Voss stood near the front pew, as if he had been carved there overnight. Relief, or something like it, washed Voss's face clean, leaving it younger and ruinously tender. The edges of him were softening, a candle burning through the last inch of wax. "Thank you," he said. And words like that, in a mouth like his, made Elias want to strike him and embrace him both. "You told half the truth," Elias answered. "But you told it. It was all I had left." Voss looked to the apse. His lips parted the way a man's do when, after years of captivity, someone opens a door he's forgotten how to pass through. "Listen," Elias did. There was nothing, no whisper, no hum. The silence had changed key. It was no longer a held note. It was rest. For the first time since he had turned the chapel's lock, the room wanted nothing from him. "It's done," Elias said. "For me," Voss said softly. He stepped backward toward the aisle. His edges frayed. The shadow that should have lain under his shoes did not remember to follow. "For you, it begins." The priest's outline thinned into dust motes. His mouth formed a last word Elias could not hear. Then the air where he had been was only air. Elias sat. He did not pray. He watched the wall. The new Elias, his Elias, settled into pigment with a small shift, like a man finding a position he could hold. "Am I free?" Elias asked the room being honest did not answer. He felt it then, a tug no stronger than a child at a sleeve. Not compulsion, invitation. The brush, still wet where he had placed it across the palette, bled a little color into the wood. Beside his painted likeness, the faintest outlines breathed up like fish near the surface. Shoulders, a hand uncommitted, an oval waiting. Not Maeve. She had her proper place. Not the abbot. He had been released. Someone else. Someone's. The choir, it seemed, had more stanzas. Elias understood. He would not destroy the chapel. He could not. He would keep it from choosing indiscriminately. He would listen when the paint began to hum. And he would bargain with it the way a father bargains with a fever. Measured. Practical, awake through the night. He rose, took the oil and walked the threshold. Salt scattered from his fingers like astonished snow. He closed the crypt with the reverse of Maeve's sign and felt the seal take, a lock, a click, a hush. When he returned to the apse, the new outlines had faded back a hair, as if respecting his statement. "Enough," he told the wall gently. For tonight, the wall obeyed. Candle flames steadied. The ravens outside tacked on the wind and slipped away toward the far ridge, as if summoned to other sentences. Elias lay on the pew and stared up into timber blackened by a fire it had not suffered. He slept with his hands open, palms up, as if to prove he held nothing. He dreamed of Maeve standing in a door of color, smiling in that small way that means victory and grief share a room. When he woke, the sun was a coin on the floor. His likeness on the wall regarded him with a quiet he recognized. The silence remained. He washed his brushes and, because there is dignity in maintenance, he put every tool back where it belonged. The receipt in his pocket crackled when he moved. He smoothed it, folded it once, and slipped it behind the altar in a crack meant for folded papers, the prayer niche of a practical faith. A document of sale, a vow disguised as an invoice. Outside, the desert smelled of dust and creosote and a sky about to harden. Elias locked the door and put the key in his pocket, knowing exactly what keys are for. Years thinned the paint on the town sign. The feed store rebuilt. The boy became a man with a hammer that did not seek tragedy. The rectory window that never remembered to catch light was boarded up, then unboarded by a committee that could not agree what ghosts were worth. Travelers still came through when the highway spat them out thirsty and surprised. Most noticed the chapel, the way you notice a stone too square on a hill. A few turned up the dirt road and parked where the mesquite gave a grudging patch of shade. One morning, A morning ordinary enough to permit omen. The traveller was a woman with a map, folded like origami and a debt to luck. She had the posture of a person who had survived a bureaucracy and now trusted paper more than conversation. Dust plumed behind her boots as she climbed. On the bell tower, a raven shook itself and reassembled into the appropriate bird. A hand-lettered notice hung crooked on the door, the ink tidy as a parish ledger. For sale, 100 beneath a smaller note. To be kept, not owned, she frowned. She had not come to buy, only to look and, if looking pleased her, to tell someone at dinner that she had found a ruin worth saving. She put her fingers to the iron ring. The metal was cold, though the day had begun to warm. The keyhole had no key. The door, when she pushed, moved with the permission of a thing that has been asked properly. Air rolled out. A cellar-cool draught that lifted the hair on her forearms. Though she would say later it was the temperature and not superstition. The nave laid itself before her, humble, intact, washed clean with a light that seemed to understand stone. She made a soft sound. The private syllable people make at art they have not yet been told to admire. Her gaze rose. The murals were recent, she thought. How could paint make centuries look like yesterday? The choir gathered in layered harmonies of color and quiet. In the lower register, a woman knelt, the paint so delicate at her lashes that the traveller nearly looked away from the intimacy. Farther along, a row of monks watched with their calm that had learned to be calm. And there, centre-left upper span, a man looked out with grave patience, his mouth at rest, his eyes carrying light honestly. She felt absurdly that he saw her. Elias saw her. The thought embarrassed her, and she straightened as if posture could cancel a feeling. "Hello?" she called, because the living should announce themselves among the dead. From a pocket of shadow near the front pew, a voice answered. Not from the shadow exactly, but from the comfortable place where a voice becomes a habit of a building. "Welcome," it said, warm, dry, a little amused. "Every masterpiece needs a keeper," she spun, hands lifted to polite defense. No one stood where the voice had stood. The pews kept their counsel. The light did not reveal a trick. "Is someone here?" She tried, chastising herself even as she smiled. The echo, if there was one, arrived late and wrong. She stepped farther in, exactly 4 careful steps, because care feels like a contract. Her eyes returned to the wall despite herself. The man in the upper register, the one whose gaze had steadied her, seemed absurdly to angle a fraction toward her, as if acknowledging the courtesy of her entrance. The paint at his temples held the soft shine of oil that has learned to be light, not grease. For a flicker, she smelled something like clove. She noticed then the smallest details, the salt line along the threshold, faint as a memory of snow. The crypt seemed so fine a broom would miss it. The stub of a candle that had guttered short of its life and then decided to last. She noticed, too, the hand-lettered sign tucked into a niche beside the altar. "Do not touch the walls. They will touch you back." The script was calm, not theatrical. A keeper's handwriting. She laughed once, softly, because warnings make tourists braver. Then something, no more than the suggestion of a draft, passed along her sleeve, tugging as if a child had caught a thread and wanted to see where it led. "No," the voice said. Closer now. "Kind." "Not you," the traveller froze. Her breath became an inventory she could not complete. She thought of the map in her pocket, the arithmetic of her days, the chain of errands that proved she lived in a world that behaved. She took a step back, then another. The chapel allowed it. When she reached the door, she paused and looked once more. Elias's painted eyes, if that is who he was, held not entrapment but warning. The sort of warning a man gives because he loves what he guards and does not wish harm to come from it. Outside, ravens circled, not portentous now but efficient, as if scribbling the day's addendum across the sky. The traveller pulled the notice from the nail, read the price again, shook her head with a smile that meant what a story this would make, and rehung it with more care than she'd taken it down. As she stepped off the stoop, the door behind her creaked and eased itself narrower, precise as a mouth closing on a secret. The temperature fell a degree, as if a cellar had briefly remembered its duty. On the far ridge, a thin wind drew a line along the land, and the chapel received it like a page receives a sentence. Inside, in the apse where color had learned to be prophecy, a new outline drifted up beside Elias's portrait, the most tentative oval, a shoulder undecided, a hand not yet committed to being a hand. The lines dimmed, then waited, polite, patient, the way a choir waits on a conductor's raised palm. The nave held the silence a moment longer. Then somewhere deep in stone, that had heard too many final words to believe in last things, a hinge sighed, a door, perhaps this door, perhaps the one beneath, began to open again, and cold air spilled out to complete the circle. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.